Good morning. Huawei is a Chinese telecom company, and Huawei was the primary target of U.S. semiconductor sanctions during the first Trump administration, and they intensified during the Biden presidency. And Huawei is a major, huge company here. And so the thinking went that if the United States and Europe cut off exports of Western technology to Huawei, that nobody else in China could build it, and they would never be able to catch up. It was the nuclear option to halt China's rise, is how Bloomberg called it 6 years ago. Blacklisting Huawei would put the company at risk, along with Huawei's customers around the world. Huawei will be unable to upgrade software or repair or maintain equipment. Putting Huawei on the entity list meant that the companies selling to them needs special government permission to do so. For example, Google's Android is the most popular OS for smartphones. Huawei makes smartphones, so they won't be able to use Android in them, and this could lead to Huawei's destruction. Huawei was highly dependent on other U.S. companies as well. Qualcomm for processors, Lumentum for cable, Western Digital for data storage, TI for some other chips, Oracle for software. So we put this circlet on them, because without our companies, Huawei cannot even maintain regular business operations, let alone grow further. This one is from 2020, when CNBC reported that Huawei was running out of the chips it needs to build smartphones, and had very few options to build new Kirin chips. Huawei may survive 2020, they said, but it's hard to see how they make it through 2022. CNN said the new sanctions were a lethal blow to Huawei. The new U.S. sanctions could be the final nail in Huawei's coffin for mobile phones. Now, these are publications that I subscribe to. I pay money to read Bloomberg and Fortune. CNBC and CNN are free, and I guess I can't complain, but I can't help but notice that most of the people I meet here in China have the newest Huawei phones, which should not exist, according to all these analysts here. Huawei shouldn't exist. But Huawei isn't merely surviving, but they're thriving. Huawei 2024 revenues, nearly back to where they were when all these sanctions started. A sharp jump in 2024. Core businesses of telecommunications and consumer, smartphones and computers growing faster. Sales up 38% year over year in that segment. Company-wide up 22.4%. Huawei also spends much more on R&D than ever. Remember when we put Huawei on the entity list, and that meant they couldn't build telecom towers across the world? They booked sales in that division of 370 billion renminbi. That's over $50 billion, with large-scale deployment of next-generation 5G networks. And last year, Huawei rolled out 5.5G, which is much more advanced than 5G, and our companies can't even build 5.5 yet. Huawei wasn't supposed to be able to build smartphones either, but they built semiconductors here in China that allowed Huawei to sell $42 billion worth of those, not just here in China, but across the world. We cut them off of Android for their OS, so they built their own, Harmony. And what Huawei did in their electronics was also being done economy-wide by thousands of other technology, finance, and energy companies here. It was an official directive dubbed Delete America, but it applied to all foreign software at use anywhere in Chinese systems. The purpose was to focus on building domestic supply chains to source everything important, basically, computer chips, military hardware, to food. CNBC told us not long ago that Huawei was running out of the chips and couldn't build a new generation of Kirin chips. But Huawei has a new Kirin chip and is moving away from Intel and Windows, phasing out US hardware and software in their computers. And Huawei developed other Kirin chips for their phones. Kirin has already replaced Qualcomm chips in Huawei smartphones, and industry analysts now admit that it's Qualcomm who has serious problems now. Because not only did Huawei build their newest phones without Qualcomm, and they'll never use Qualcomm again, but the sales of Huawei phones are so strong that other brands that use Qualcomm chips are losing market share. So this is where things stand now for Huawei. They're much better off today compared to a few years ago. 70% of Huawei's sales are here in China, and they have basically no exposure to the new tariffs. And we could say this is generally true of most Chinese companies as well. China's economy is far less dependent on US exports than previously. In 2020, 42% of US imports were inbound China. Now it's 13%, less than a third previously. And this is another striking difference between then and now. Huawei and China's high-tech industries were heavily dependent on US technology, our hardware and software. We believe that if we cut them off from that technology, that they could not develop their own. Now it's the other way around. The US is dependent on China for essential semiconductor chips and the tech that goes into our phones and our computers. The White House implemented a 145% across-the-board tariff on Chinese goods, then backed that off to 20% a few days later when somebody realized that for this wide range of computer-related products, laptops, drives, displays, devices, chips, it is now we who are dependent on China for all those things. This is Tibet. Xizang. Be good.
What you will eat, or what you'll drink, or what you'll wear. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Ask, and it will be given to you.